like so YWAM is geared toward like 18, like 20, 20, like 3, 24 year olds and things like that. Um, I I don't know about you guys. I would love to hear your guys' stories like during breaks and things like that. Um, but I did mine kind of like a non-traditional like type of way where I graduated college. Um, in like in my home area, I graduated from college, like a university about an hour south of my hometown in Pittsburgh. And I worked in like newspapers and media for 3 years, being a copy editor and just working in media and things like that. And it wasn't until that a third year where God made it abundantly clear. I didn't really know how to hear God's voice, but in that he made it abundantly clear to come and do YWAM um, through a lot of different things that he was doing. And then in 2018, uh, after my job kind of ended, and then I worked at a clothing store in retail for 9 months to save up some money. And then in 2018, I did my DTS in my hometown. And then so I did it in the fall. We went on outreach to Africa in the like winter from December, and we got back in February. And then I was like, while we were on outreach, God always placed like the a Bible school, like doing a Bible school, wanting to read, like a passion for like wanting to read the Word of God. I was always interested in like wanting to know who I was serving and why I was following God, why I was a Christian. Like, what is this book that we preach out of, that we read about all the time? Like, I want to read it. Like, I want to know it for myself. I want to know what I'm believing. And I had so many people on my outreach and my DTS that had done a DBS or an SBS. And so I was like praying constantly, like, do you want me to go on? Do you want me to do a DBS? The only one I knew of was in Boston. So do you want me to do a DBS? Do you want me to do an SBS? Like maybe in like Switzerland or something? Or do you want me to just come on staff in Pittsburgh and I would just jump right into everything? And after we got back from outreach, he was just constantly asking me to wait. And then once we got back from outreach, he made it very clear to do the DBS. And a couple months later, I was in Boston. And then 2 weeks into that school, unbeknownst to me, he asked me to stay. And that was not my plan. I was planning to go back to Pittsburgh and staff there. But there's something about the school where he asked me to stay in a very uncomfortable place. Um, and then throughout the school, that passion for him and his word just grew more and more and more. Um, and so I ended up staffing uh, for the DBS here, along with the DTS here for the first couple of years I was on staff. And then since I've kind of been um, there's been other things I've kind of been working on, serving, taking like a kind of a backseat and serving in just random places in our ministry here. And while at the same time, seeing how he's really been laying a passion on my heart to not just like staff schools, but to teach as well. And like what your leaders were getting as far as for this week and for the next couple weeks for the prophets is so real that like God's intention throughout this entire school, but especially in the prophets with the language that they use and um really just seeing the relationships at the forefront not just how God is talking to the Israelite people, but the individual prophet's relationship with God. Everything that is being communicated is showing God's heart for humanity. And we've been reading about that throughout the historical books, through the wisdom literature, through poetic literature of like Song of Solomon and things like that. But through the language of prophets, we see such dense and heavy, weighted symbolism and imagery that God is using to communicate his heart, whether he's talking about judgment, whether he's talking about hope and restoration. Everything is taught is him communicating his heart and how he desires a relationship with people, and how he's brought to anger, frustration, and sadness because people are not wanting him. So what your leaders are saying and what your leaders are getting is so true, in that he is communicating these same things to us as well. And so, like, I am in total agreement with your leaders that our prayer is for you guys to open your hearts this week. Don't shy away from the prophets. I've been in your I don't know where you guys are at. So let me ask this question first off. Like, does has anybody kind of been shy or timid or afraid of opening up the prophetic books before? I know I have. Has anybody else been in that position? Thank you guys for your honesty. Who loves reading the prophetic books? Anybody love reading the prophetic books? Hey, I see a couple. Okay. And so we all come from those different places, but I've been in that same position, and I always struggled reading the prophets. I was always like, this is the hardest thing to read. These books, especially when you get into Isaiah this week, and then next week when you guys read Jeremiah and Ezekiel, some of the longest books in all of the Bible. And but you're reading like 16 different books. That's essentially, it looks like, if you just summarize everything, it's saying the same thing again and again and again and again and again. But in that, this past year, when I was able to teach to the Lausanne school for the first time, was the first time I was able to teach the prophets. And I always was like, I don't want to teach this. It's the most dreadful thing I want to read. Like, it's like, I love you, but I don't want to teach this. And because it was always so difficult. But when I was praying about it and then going through and preparing the teaching and then opening up the books and really see the way the Lord met me in that and spoke to me in that, was the most like beautiful times with the Lord some of the most beautiful times with the Lord I've ever had in my life. And whether it's early prophets, late prophets, the post-exilic prophets, I've had the chance now over the course of this year to be able to teach them all. And and it's the same thing every time, reading through them. It's seeing God's heart for humanity and how it's continuing on from Genesis all the way through as he's trying to communicate to the people that are in sin, how he hates the fact that they're in sin and how he longs for a relationship with them, and how he's even bringing restoration to the people so that he can be in relationship with them. And so our prayer this week, for the rest of this week, even though you're getting close to the halfway point of the school might seem like you've read a lot of books. It might be long. You guys might be tired, all these things. but don't shy away from what God is doing in these books. Press in. For those of you that love reading the prophetic books, encourage your fellow students to press in even harder because of the richness of what God is going to bring this week. And so like that's the reason I love that's the reason I love being able to teach. That's the thing. That's what really gripped me about like through from my DBS until now, just being able to communicate God's heart to people is the thing I love most about it. And he does that through the information, but he also does that through like just the language that he writes. And we can see it all how he expresses it. No matter how you no matter how you guys take in information, if you take it no matter what type of literature you may like to read, whether it's history or whether it's poetic or symbolism or you like letters, God's communicating his heart through all styles of writing. And so it's like it's cool to see how God communicates to us. And I really hope that um yeah, that God moves throughout this week. And so yeah, without further ado, let's get into it, okay? And so we're gonna go through real quick. We're gonna go through kind of before we get into the books themselves. We're gonna go through an overview of what it means to be um, a prophet and what it is to give prophecy according to the Old Testament. What is a biblical prophet and what is biblical prophecy? What does that look like? Well, and then throughout the rest of the day, we're gonna go through Joel and hopefully the book of Amos or the beginnings of the book of Amos. And so let's start by just talking about what a prophet is. And so biblically, prophets are loyal servants of God and against idolatry. They are representatives in the midst of corrupted priesthood. That is their main function, to be God's loyal servants, his representatives in the midst of, especially when we're talking about the time of the kings, when even the kings of God, of God's chosen people, are not following the ways of the Lord, and the priesthood, who are supposed to be mediators between God and man, they are not following in the ways of the Lord. So everything is corrupted. So God is bringing his representatives to speak against them. And so in Isaiah later on this week, when you guys read in Isaiah 21, the prophets are depicted as watchmen for God, for the people. Ezekiel also talks about this, and Habakkuk also talks about this when you guys read next week. And what that means is, so in ancient Near East cities, you usually had a wall surrounding the cities to kind of like be the protection and fortify the city. But there's different gates that connect the walls, and each gate has multiple towers where guards stand watch, so that if enemies are coming in and coming toward the city, no matter from what side enemies are coming, there can be a guard standing watch to then proclaim to the rest of the city that the enemy is coming, that a battle is about to ensue. And so they're preparing the people for a coming attack. And so for biblically in the Old Testament, for prophets to be watchmen, they are essentially depicted as standing at the gate, waiting for God to bring his judgment to the people and them to his message to the city, because they are not for God. They are not living for God. They are not mediating between God and man. In fact, they are corrupted. And so the kings, especially in Israel, you guys talked about it in Kings Week last week. How many of the kings in Israel were good?
None. Oh, in Israel.
None. How many of the 20 were good in Judah?
Four.
A little bit more than that.
4.5.
There was about eight that were depicted. Yeah, there was about eight that were depicted as doing good in the eyes of the Lord in some way. But still, it's below 50%. So of the 40 kings between Israel and Judah, 8 of them were good. That's not a good percentage. And so in that, the priesthood is corrupted as well, because they're just hired yes men that are serving the idols and the other gods that the kings are allowing the people to worship. That is the type of evil that they are doing in the eyes of the Lord. They are leading, instead of being God's chosen people set apart for service of him, they are instead going to other gods as they were commanded not to do. And so instead of being with God, aligned with God, they are now opposing God, and God is bringing messages of judgment, attacks, waging war against the nations of Israel and Judah. And these prophets are depicted as watchmen, God's representatives standing watch at the gate, telling the people of what is actually true. And that's what prophecy, and that's what biblical prophecy is in the Old Testament. It's speaking the truth of God. And usually it has a double meaning. Usually it is telling forth or proclaiming the truth of God to the people in the present time that we're reading, but it's also foretelling of a future time that is to come. And so what they're typically doing, because the people are corrupted and following other gods and following and worshiping other idols, the prophets are calling people back to radical obedience of Yahweh. But they're not just doing it in a way that's like this. And I'll give you an example. I'll just read the opening couple verses of Joel to give you an understanding. This is how they're not reading. Okay? This is how they're not speaking. Hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your forefathers? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their grandchildren, and their children to the next generation. Like, anybody can speak like that, but that's not the way the prophets are speaking. Rather, they're not speaking just to inform them, but with no emotion, but they're actually speaking in a way that moves the people. How they are speaking is actually not just speaking to their minds, but speaking to their hearts, speaking to their emotions, because God is trying to move them, calling them to radical obedience, to move them to action, to stir their hearts, to stir their emotions. So it's more like reading it like this: wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine. Wail because of the new wine, for it has been snatched from your lips. A nation has invaded my land. a powerful and without number. It has the teeth of a lion, the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vines and ruined my fig trees. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it away, leaving their branches white. Like everything that they're saying is with passion, with emotion, because it's stirring their hearts, help getting them to understand that it's not just, it's getting them to understand using language, like symbolic language that they would understand, to stir their hearts to go back to radical obedience of Yahweh. Is everything making sense so far?
Yeah.
I just have a question.
What's up? Go ahead.
I didn't get the difference, talking about prophecy, about tells forth and foretells. Like what? I didn't get like the point.
So if I'm telling forth, that means in like the present time, I am like telling forth, I am proclaiming out in real time what God is going to do in that present age to those people that he's speaking to directly to. But the prophets and prophecy is also their foretelling. So that means they're speaking to something of a future event that is to come.
Thank you.
Does that help at all? Okay, to continue on to speak more to the relationship of a prophet, to between the relationship between God and man, where the kings and the priests and the people were living in a corrupted way outside of the ways of the Lord. The prophets, their lives are characterizing the relationship that God wants to have with humanity. So we see the evidence of the authority of the Lord on display, and also the obedience of the prophets, that they're living in the fear of the Lord because they know the authority that he has. And in that, as they walk in obedience, God places his authority over the prophets as his representatives. And they give a message that their message gives a requirement of the people to choose either covenant obedience as they are walking in, or disobedience like the people are continuing in. And that covenant is established again to make Israel a holy nation serving Yahweh only. This is going all the way back to, we can recount times in Genesis. We can recount even Moses receiving the law during Exodus, where they are given the law to be God's chosen people. And then going even further into the times of Joshua, it's because remember, he's calling them to be God's chosen people, to go out and eliminate all of the evil that surrounds them from on the evil nations that surround them on every side. And also, it's not just that God gives them messages to give to the people, but they also, the prophets are always recorded as going back to the Lord in prayer. There's always that relationship where the prophets are communicating with God continuously. And so we mentioned it when we talked about prophecy earlier, but it's usually not just a prediction of future events. It's a part of prophecy, but it's not all it is. Talk about prophecy, it's not just fortune telling. It's not like people in today's age where you're reading poems or telling people about to have that. There's part of what's happening. So, like we said before, it's speaking to the people directly and what's going to directly happen to the people in their present time and to future events. But when we take note of everything that is said in the prophets, the majority of the prophecies that we read about in the Old Testament have been fulfilled. What the people are waiting for are the messianic prophecies or the prophecies of the new covenant age. But if we look in the Old Testament and we take up all the and then we take into account all of the prophecies that are made, less than 2% of the prophets' messages are about the messianic, are about coming messianic king that was promised. Less than 5% of the prophecies are speaking to a future future new covenant age. And then less than 1% are prophecies of even future events, even past that new covenant, that will maybe what we think time. So the overwhelming prophecies that we read about are actually fulfilled in when we read about the judgments that God declares to Judah, Israel, and all of the surrounding nations. When he's talking about his restoration of the people back to the land, all of those things he fulfilled. Read the prophecies. He's the
connection is really unstable.
we even are in a time where we see these things. The Messiah known before.
Eric, hey Eric, can you pause
Is
a
everything
second?
okay, guys?